Welcome back to the next lecture. This time, we're going to be talking about nasal breathing and its downstream effects it can have on the rest of the body. So the first thing we're going to talk about is rhinitis, or inflammation in the nose. Now, rhinitis is when a reaction occurs that causes nasal congestion, runny nose, sneezing, and itching. Most types of rhinitis are caused by an inflammation and are associated with symptoms in the eye, ears, and throat, according to Johns Hopkins. Now, the important thing about rhinitis is it rarely occurs in isolation. You'll see it very often with asthma. You'll see it very often with sinus infections or inflammation in the sinuses. It's also twice as likely, if not more likely, more than twice as likely to happen when sleeping problems are present, which is really important. We're going to get into sleep in a bit more detail, but it's really important. Now, what is the connection here? Now, we know asthmatics tend to have an increased tendency to switch towards oral breathing. And this is interesting because it's a factor that could contribute to developing asthma in the first place. In other words, poor nasal breathing or not nasally breathing is actually a cause of mouth breathing, but at the same time, asthmatics might be more inclined to breathe through the mouth even after getting it. And you can see now how this is going to become a potential downward spiral. Now, sleep apnea. Now, this is going to come up a lot, and this is likely a large reason why many of you are taking this course. But it's a potentially serious sleep disorder in which breathing repeatedly stops and starts during sleep, obviously. This is huge because if you are not getting oxygen to the brain on a regular basis, and you are literally stopping breathing because of this, it is going to affect everything downstream, from how you feel, how you think, how you function throughout the day, energy levels, how well you can sort through more difficult situations where you really need to use that brain power. If you are not getting oxygen to the brain, there is going to be a problem. And we know open mouth breathing during sleep is a risk factor for obstructive sleep apnea, and it's associated with increased disease severity and upper airway collapsibility. Now, we're going to talk about that stuff later, but keep this in mind because oral breathing, mouth breathing, and sleep apnea are very tightly connected. We know that treatment, and when we're talking about treatment for sleep apnea, pediatric OSA and sleep disorder breathing means restoration of continuous breathing during wakefulness and sleep nasally. In other words, what is one of the best ways, or probably the best way that we know of right now to help mitigate symptoms of sleep apnea and sleep disorder breathing? It's actually reintroducing and re-educating nasal breathing in kids and adults, but particularly in kids because they're still developing, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. According to this study, so the case against mouth breathing is growing, and given its negative consequences, we feel that the restoration of the nasal breathing route as early as possible is critical. In other words, the earlier you start incorporating nasal breathing, generally the better health outcomes these kids will have for the rest of their lives. And that has to do with they're still developing, their skull is still developing. You can still influence kind of how those bones grow and how they are all going to fall into place, which is literally going to dictate how you breathe for the rest of your life. Also from that study, in fact, restoration of nasal breathing during wake and sleep may be the only valid, complete correction of pediatric sleep disorder breathing. So again, if you, or especially if your kids are taking this course, it is so vital to start this early and continue it, because this is literally going to affect how your children develop going forward. Now, talking about ADHD, what are some of the common symptoms we see? We see sleep disturbances. We see poor attention, lack of paying attention in school, poor performance in school, and hyperactivity. These are all mental complications seen in many children related to their nasal allergies. And many of these children are misdiagnosed as ADD and ADHD, when actually it could be a potential issue when it comes to breathing and attached to that breathing apparatus. And what do we see? We see that most children with ADHD displayed symptoms consistent with allergic rhinitis. In other words, those who tend to get a little bit more sick or get stuffy noses tend to be more likely to have a diagnosis of ADHD. And again, what this study says, nasal obstruction and other symptoms of allergic rhinitis could explain some of the cognitive patterns observed with ADHD, which might result from disturbances known to occur from allergic rhinitis. Now, if we take kind of what I mentioned before when talking about sleep apnea, and if we're having issues nasally breathing at night and we're not getting enough oxygen to the brain, do you not think how that's going to affect how you feel and act in your day-to-day? So something to think about. Now, here's a really great example. So all three pictures are of this same child, just at different times in that child's life. So in the left picture, we have this boy, he's 10 years old. As far as we know, or as far as the doctor knew at this point, he was a nose breather. You could see he has good facial development. You have the jaw kind of pretty well defined. Those are all things that we're kind of looking at. Everything is kind of proportional. The middle picture, same boy, 14 years old. He was given a gerbil as a birthday present. Turns out he might have been allergic to it, and he began to suffer with clogged noses, stuffy noses. He started breathing through his mouth a bit more. And what you can see at age 17 now, this is after living with the gerbil for a few years. You can see how this has literally affected how this boy's face developed. You can see the receding jaw here. You can see the protruded nose and how the bottom lip is much further behind the top lip. That's not necessarily what we want to look. And you can see how this affects him, kind of going, how it could affect literally the development of the young kids. So really important to understand. What you find is that mouth breathers tend to demonstrate considerable backwards and downward rotation of the mandible. So again, if you look at this picture on the right, downward and backward, this is what we're having. You're seeing that jaw not come out as far, push backwards. Overjet, which is protrusion, which is again the front, the top of the maxilla, those teeth are going to be pushed forward, and increase in the mandible plane angle. So you're getting a longer face. So they find that children with obligate mouth breathing due to nasal septum deviation show facial developments and dental anomalies in comparison with nose breathing controls. So again, this could literally affect, if in kids, if all of your baby teeth haven't fallen out yet, and it affects how those teeth grow in. So in other words, if you tend to be mouth breathers, chances are you'll see more issues when it comes to new teeth, adult teeth growing in. And you see, and we all see it, there's more kids now that need braces than ever before. And a lot of this can be due to, large degree can be due to breathing. There are other dietary changes that play a role, but breathing is going to affect the development of the face and the mouth. Then we come to talking a lot, and this is kind of ironic since I'm talking through this, but speech is essentially the combining of breathing and communication. So it's our ability to communicate while using the breath, stimulating vocal cords to create sounds that make sense to us, right? So it's important to understand here that because there are multiple different areas of the brain, different systems involved, we have to take a holistic approach. So for example, there are questions we need to ask, like, is there frequent throat clearing or excessive phlegm? Does that person pause when they're speaking? Are their pauses appropriate, or are they out of place, or are they really, really frequent? Does the pitch, the person's voice sound appropriate for the age and gender of that person? Then we have things like dysphonia, which is excessive breathing volume. It's associated to it. This dries out the vocal folds, resulting in phlegm, and this results in poor breathing patterns and breath management for speech and singing. So if you're in the arts, if you tend to talk a lot, these are things to be aware of. In dysphagia, overbreathing dries again the upper airways, which can lead to inflammation long term. This is why slowing down the breathing and being more mindful is really important. So, if we have those drier airways, that's going to affect us swallowing kind of when we're eating. So, again, something to kind of keep in mind and be aware of. Then we get to the autonomic nervous system. Now, the autonomic nervous system and breathing are very, very tightly correlated. Now, the autonomic nervous system is regulated or is a component of the peripheral nervous system that regulates things like heart rate or breath rate, blood pressure, respiration, digestion, sexual arousal, body temperature, metabolism, mineral balance in the body, urination and defecation, and emotions and behavior. Now, the parasympathetic nervous system is thought to be, it creates a calm physiological state that promotes growth, restoration, and repair. This is why you'll also hear the parasympathetic nervous system called the rest and digest part. The sympathetic nervous system you'll more commonly hear called the fight or flight response. And this is triggered when we are in a stressful situation. And you could see what happens in a sympathetic state. Pupils dilate. We don't create as much saliva. The airways dilate because we need to get more air in. Our heart rate increases. Digestion really slows down to a halt. We release more adrenaline or epinephrine. All of these things are things that we need so blood gets shunted away from digestion to the muscle so we can either fight or run away from a potential threat. What we find is in children who tend to stutter or have issues with asthma, ADHD, chronic nose infections, sinus infections, they tend to be in a state where they are more in a sympathetic state. So what they find is in these kids that they tend to be more vulnerable or emotional, react emotionally, which is a sign of less parasympathetic tone, but also you get mobilization of resources to support a stress response. So you get lower parasympathetic tone and higher sympathetic tone. Now you're creating an environment for chronic stress where this can lead to real issues if it's consistent. And if that's constantly triggered, if we're constantly triggered in that fight or flight response, that's going to lead to, again, chronic stress, adrenal fatigue. Now you're talking about all different hormones getting out of whack, and it could lead to a constellation of different issues. So getting back into nasal breathing, improving nitric oxide levels, coming back, regulating that breathing pattern and breathing tone is going to be key for finding balance with the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. And that's ultimately kind of where we're at with this. So breathing directly affects how the autonomic nervous system is stimulated and how it's going to act. Nasal breathing, light breathing, slow breathing, diaphragmatic breathing is a key component to managing the autonomic nervous system in an appropriate way. This is why when we talk about fixing the nervous system first, breathing is directly correlated to that. So this is where we're going to stop for today. I hope this makes a lot of sense. I'll see you guys in the next video.